You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Homefield Apparel.
Welcome back to CrimsonCast. Galen Clavio joining you. It is Friday, March 21st. Happy day 2 of the NCAA tournament for those who celebrate, which I think is everybody in the audience. At least I would hope so. Happy first day of the tournament to the IU women as they take on Utah early this afternoon. So if you're quick, you're listening to or watching this before that game. But if not, hopefully the ladies carried through and pulled off the victory. And if they do, they'll almost certainly be playing South Carolina on Monday of this upcoming week. So let's keep an eye on that and see what happens. Tony Adragna are going to be joining us here on the show. And Tony, first of all, welcome. Great to see you. How you doing?
I am fantastic. Always a pleasure being here on CrimsonCast. Excited to talk some coaching. No longer candidates. You know, we're talking a coaching hire, so that's exciting to be doing.
An actual coaching hire. I think it's we deserve this after the 6+ weeks of trying to anticipate what was going on with this hire. We're going to talk all about that and talk about what exactly to expect as we go into the Darian DeVries era. And I'm certainly quite fascinated to see how all of this plays out. I think everybody is as well. First of all, let's get started by reminding you that we are brought to you by Homefield Apparel here at the Back Home Network, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs. Homefield continuing to roll out some awesome stuff throughout the course of the tournament. They've got some great specials that they've shown as well. They just had a great thing on Instagram today where they were showcasing the student manager from McNeese that has his own NIL deal. That's the stuff you get on the Homefield Instagram channel. You should definitely go check it out. And go to homefieldapparel.com. Go purchase apparel. Use the code HOME23, and you can get 15% off your first order. Again, Homefield Apparel, proud sponsor of the Back Home Network. Also, just a reminder, go check out the YouTube channel for the Back Home Network. Just search Back Home Network on YouTube. You can find all of the Back Home Network podcasts in video form, and you can also subscribe at Substack, crimsoncast.substack.com for us as we continue to bring you great different videos throughout the course of the year, podcasts, articles. We have some VIP videos as well for those who want to financially support the podcast. At least I think the content's great. Maybe it's not. You might disagree, but it's been fun having so many people get into our communities on both areas, and we look forward to having you folks joining us as well. Tony, let's just dive right in. There was a lot of talk over the course of the last 3 weeks as it really heated up with the season coming to a close as far as what Indiana was going to do with their head coach hire. And they ultimately settle on Darian DeVries, who had been at Drake for 6 seasons and then was at West Virginia for 1 season. He jumps after 1 season, and we could talk a little bit about some of the financial realities behind what that move might have been inspired by. We talked a bit about that yesterday with Zach Osterman on the podcast. So if you haven't checked that out, go check that podcast out. But for Tony, for you, I wanted to kind of focus first and foremost on what IU was getting with Darian DeVries. You did a great breakdown video the day that he got hired, kind of highlighting some of the different things that his teams do. Can you give us I want people to go watch your video. It's about 30 minutes long. There's a lot of really great stuff. But can you give us a thumbnail sketch of what Darian DeVries has preferred to do and what you expect to see him bringing to Bloomington?
Yeah, honestly, if anybody watched Creighton yesterday, I think that's kind of Darian DeVries. Like, obviously, he's a protege of Greg McDermott. I do think that he focuses a little bit more on the defensive end. He kind of talked through that in his press conference that he's very defensive focused, defensive minded. He kind of runs his offense with defense in mind. But he wants to get out and run if he can. He's not going to do it recklessly. He kind of noted we want to score in the first 12 seconds, and that's because the defense isn't set yet. You're playing against a broken defense. He thinks that's your best opportunity to score. If you don't score in those first 12 seconds, then you're setting up your offense. His offense, very much motion based. He wants to have a good, strong point guard that can kind of run the show, that can score it, can distribute it. And then obviously, the last several seasons, he's had his son, who is just an absolute sniper. Shot 48% from deep at West Virginia before he was injured. Um, so he played in 8 games, I believe, with West Virginia. But he runs a lot of sets for shooters. It's a lot of things that are going to be music to Indiana fans' ears because it's just something that you haven't seen happen at IU in quite some time. Running a shooter off screens and running actions to get the guy that's got the hot hand going. And then you've heard everybody kind of say it, but he's a grinder. He works. He's just a ball coach. Like there wasn't anything in his press conference that made me think or made anybody think probably like, hey, this is some grand personality of a hire. It's just like this dude just wants to get in, coach ball. And even like, I don't know if you saw the Hoosiers Connect video of him, like I'm Darian DeVries and I'm in for Indiana. Like you could tell he's not comfortable like in that type of setting. Even in his presser, like his written statement and how he talked about like basketball in his written words versus when he just answered questions and was talking shop off the cuff, like that was more like what we're going to get, I think, in terms of a coach. So all in all, I'm excited about the hire. I'll say that.
Quick correction before we move forward. If the women win today, they'll actually play Sunday, not Monday. My brain is
In my head, I was thinking like, is the women different? Like, did they do 2 days rest?
I screwed it up because in my brain, I thought for whatever reason, I'm like, hey, we got through the first round of the NCAA tournament. We're in the first day of the first round. So, yeah,
it was a long Thursday for Galen, everybody.
No, seriously. I watched 13 straight hours of basketball, got 6 hours of sleep. I'm back at it again here podcasting this morning. But my apologies to our women's basketball fans and the team. Yeah, but they play on Sunday, not Monday. Anyway, that's assuming they beat Utah today, which hopefully they will. It's funny. I will remind everybody because there were some folks who were like, that the Hoosiers Connect in for Indiana video. They were like, well, that was a little awkward. I'll remind everybody Signetti's initial in for Indiana video was also kind of awkward. And then we found that he loosened up quite a bit as he got more comfortable on the mic and at the podium. But yeah, there's a bunch of things I want to unpack there. And I want to start off with the coaching aspects, like the straight up X's and O's. Watching that Creighton game yesterday against Louisville, it was a really interesting study because obviously I think everybody's been impressed with what Pat Kelsey did at Louisville in his first year. Has a really athletic team led by a kind of a dynamic driving point guard. And a lot of people, myself included, thought, well, Louisville is underseeded. They're going to be able to take care of business against Creighton. Creighton came out and had just a stellar game offensively. I mean, if you go back and you look at the box for that game, Creighton ended up scoring 1.27 points per possession. They shot 11 for 24 from three in that game, which is 46%. They had 17 assists and only 10 turnovers. So their assist rate was 53%, which is awesome. And they didn't necessarily grab a ton of offensive rebounds. Their offensive rebounding percentage was only at about 21%. They didn't have a ton of steals, but they really focused on shot making and quality shots. And that was a theme I heard over and over again from DeVries during that press conference. And in watching your video, it really feels like that style of offense, the ball movement, the spacing especially, that was what stuck out watching not just Creighton yesterday, but watching all of that film of West Virginia and Drake when he was there. It's such a fundamentally different style of basketball from what Indiana has run offensively the last 8 seasons. It was almost jarring to watch that and think that might be Indiana next year. Obviously we're starting almost from scratch, possibly with the roster. There's no assurances that anybody's coming back off the current roster, and the only person we feel like 100% certain is going to be on the roster, provided he gets a waiver, is Tucker DeVries. We saw a lot of Tucker DeVries, who's got a lot of Doug McDermott in his game, big like 6'6" guy who can. I think what's impressive about what Darian DeVries does with Tucker DeVries in running him off screens is how quickly he can catch the ball and release, almost Reggie Miller-like just in terms of the speed, not necessarily the form. What does DeVries need to do, Darian DeVries need to do in terms of roster construction to put together a team that can do the kinds of things that he likes to do offensively? Because he clearly didn't have that for most of the season at West Virginia this year.
Yeah, I think if he could get Javon Small or a type like him at point guard is certainly ideal. Which is like a duh. Of course, you want a first team All Big 12 player, but a guy that can run the show, like I said, at offense, but on both ends. Because I'm going to use a cuss word here. He uses the pack line. Uh, and I know that there are certainly some reservations about that because it's the same defense Archie Miller led. I do want to note that Archie Miller did have pretty solid defenses at Indiana. That wasn't really the problem. But anyway, in the pack line, you want that kind of the head of the snake to apply ball pressure, and you're constantly pressuring, constantly pressuring. And so he's going to want somebody that can play two ways at the point guard, and that's why a lot of people are like, I think Miles Rice could fit that role. I don't know on the defensive end, because his guards really got to be physical. Um, at the point of attack. And I just don't know that Miles Rice has that in him to play 32 minutes of just hard-nosed D, just harassing the other team's point guard up and down. I may be wrong. I think offensively Miles Rice does fit a mold there.
Yeah, it's interesting with Rice because, like, physically, he and Javon Small are almost the same size. Small is 6'3", 190, South Bend native. I actually didn't realize that until I started digging in. And then Rice
also played in Indianapolis for a year. He played at Franklin Central High School.
Yep, had an interesting career in college. Went East Carolina to Oklahoma State, and then ended up at West Virginia this last year. But Rice, 6'3", 185, almost exactly the same size. I am interested. Part of it felt like Rice got so off his game offensively, it affected everything else. So I think that's a really fascinating first question. And, I don't know that you can go into a season trusting Miles Rice as your point guard from the defensive perspective. So it feels like at the very least, he's going to have to go out and get somebody who can apply that level of defensive pressure, but also can be a lot more efficient in terms of ball distribution than Miles Rice was. Miles Rice went from 281st in assist rate in the country his freshman year at Washington State to not in the top 500 in assist rate. Now, how much of that was Miles Rice and how much of that was the offensive system? That's a question mark, but it is a really interesting thing and obviously a key point that Indiana is going to have to address very early.
Absolutely. And it kind of lends to the next point is, at the wings, the 2 and the 3, he wants versatile guys that you can guard multiple positions, and be able to put the ball in the hoop, at all 3 levels. And so that's going to be ideal. Now that's like not unique to Darian DeVries, that.
Wait, you want a point guard that can pass and defend? Wow, that's unusual. Yes.
And then, I think his son's going to play the 4 primarily. Could also play out on the wing if you win a little bit bigger, but he doesn't want to play big. Hasn't played big much throughout his career. He wants a 5 that's going to be able to catch lobs and protect the rim. His team posted up. They're in the 5th percentile of percentage of post ups last year, which is also going to be music to Indiana fans' ears because Archie Miller and Mike Woodson were a lot more alike than different in terms of how they coached the game. And this is just a stark contrast from that in terms of not going to be a bunch of post ups. It's not going to be just walking the ball up the floor every single time. Defensively, I showcased this in my clip. You don't have your nail slot rim where you're just leaving shooters wide open because you're over helping in the middle ball screens. And so, yeah, ultimately he's going to want guys that can play a lot of different positions. They're versatile and they can put the ball in the hoop and they're moldable. I think the one thing that I liked that he said was, look, we're going to build a team and we're not going to sacrifice team building because we're just trying to plug holes and just accumulate talent. And that seemed like that's what Indiana had become the last couple of years, was just accumulating as much talent as you could and then trying to figure it out. Never really figured it out, right? So what I like to hear is that he's actually got a process and a plan in place for how he wants his roster to look, and he's going to go recruit to that rather than just casting this wide net and saying, let's go get as much talent as we can and we'll figure it out later.
I mean, when you look at some of the other positions, it's interesting, like playing a 6'6" guy at the 4. I mean, it's something Indiana fans have been asking for a while. The idea of playing smaller. You mentioned having, a 5 who can rim protect and who can distribute out and things like that. I mean, it feels like this is, I'm not going to say an easier style to recruit for, but it feels like there's a lot more possible plugins, especially on the transfer market, that could fill into that slot, as opposed to trying to go out and find an Omar Ballo type to replace a Khalil Ware type, to replace a Trace Jackson Davis type. It doesn't look, at least from how I've looked through things, like they don't necessarily rely on the 5 in his system to be the primary rebounder or the primary scorer, but they are there and being able to do both, as well as providing defensive help and pressure as other teams, try to break down the perimeter defensively.
Exactly. And if it's a guy like that Ware that can step out and shoot it, like that's a bonus, but I don't think that's necessarily what he needs. You mentioned recruiting for it. Not only is it easier to recruit for this style, it's harder to negative recruit against. Like Indiana was getting pounded on negative recruiting with guards because they're like, you're going to go play in this system. Look, they're in the 99th percentile every single year in terms of post ups. Their guard play is some of the worst in the Big Ten year in, year out. And so that's part of the game too, is like not having all these bullets other teams can fire at you when you're trying to recruit this style of player, which is the modern style of player. And so I think that's a big point too, that Indiana's not going to be able to just get pegged with all this negative recruiting right off the cuff in terms of their style of play.
His team at West Virginia this year, as we talked about, had to basically change what they were doing midstream because they lose Tucker DeVries to a legitimate shoulder injury. Or if you believe West Virginia fans, there was a grand conspiracy to keep him off the floor for 4 months.
And Indiana didn't target any top big dogs. They saw Darian DeVries in November and said, that's our guy.
That's the guy we want. But it is interesting. This is a coach who didn't have a lot of great defensive teams at Drake, and he managed to turn it around. And with a not great offensive team, they became one of the best defensive teams in the country over the course of this season. They had very few games where they gave up a ton of points per possession. Their worst games of the year. They had a struggle at BYU. Pretty much everybody did this year, and BYU is an outstanding offensive team. But even in that game, it was interesting. You would think against BYU, you're giving up a ton of threes. They only gave up 5 threes against BYU. They just got shredded in the interior in that game, and they didn't force a lot of turnovers. But you look at most of the rest of the time in the Big 12, they were incredibly hard to play against at times. They had games where they were forcing 22, 23, 24% turnovers for the opposition. When you look at what the caliber of athlete that he was able to utilize at West Virginia and trying to shift that system, that's the type of players he can probably attract at Indiana that he likely couldn't attract at Drake. It's just trying to get that combination right in terms of, can you get a defensively minded player who can also shoot, or can you get a guy who's a 3-and-D type who can shoot, but you can adapt to defending certain types of players. The one thing I do wonder, Tony, it's like the Big 12 has to some degree coalesced around that more positionless style of basketball at times. The Big Ten still has a lot of teams that leverage, a big post player, and it feels like a lot of other teams have had to go to that system. How effectively do you think DeVries can play against the Big Ten as it's currently constituted? What struggles do you see potentially in that transition up from where he was at in the Big 12 this year?
I think a lot of it reminds me of, and it's goofy because obviously John Beilein came from West Virginia as well, but a lot of it reminds me of John Beilein's teams in the Big Ten, where might struggle and slog through the Big Ten a little bit, but once you go out nationally, you're a powerhouse. And you go to a national championship and things like that. So it somewhat reminds me of that in terms of, do you want your team to be built to win in January, or do you want your team built to win in March? I think no further than yesterday, McNeese State and Clemson, like Will Wade, which is also a buzzword around the Indiana faithful. He talked about how like Clemson is just way bigger than us. Like I built my team to win my conference and then to win in March. I didn't build it to win against Clemson, so it'll be interesting to see us go up against this style. Well, you kind of saw how that played out in a one game match. Like,
Yeah.
they kind of dominated till the very end of the game. So to me, there could be some struggles in Big Ten play playing that style. Just night in, night out. Like it's not like every night's going to be a struggle, but like you start playing 3, 4 teams that play that style together, you might lose a stinker or something. That maybe you wouldn't if you were playing two bigs. But again, I just go back to like guards win in March, free flowing style typically wins in March. And I think it's a good thing. Like I don't think it's a bad thing. Like the Big Ten hasn't won a national title, and I get that that's somewhat misconstrued because they've played in national titles several times since 2000, but haven't
Well,
won a national title in a while,
but
and that
yeah,
could be why.
but I mean, it's interesting you say that because I always hear that rejoinder, like, well, the Big Ten's been in national title games, but then you almost have to look at, well, what Big Ten teams were in the national title game and what did they do? Like, what was their profile? And that the last, I mean, that Beeline team in 2018 is a great example of that, where that team, they were great defensively. They were third in the country defensively, but they were 35th in the country offensively. And it was a very similar style to what you see DeVries doing. It was a team that focused on effective field goal percentage and didn't turn the ball over, which made things hyper efficient for them. When you go back and look at Wisconsin from 2015, it was the exact same pattern where they were one of the best shooting teams in the country and they didn't turn the ball over. You go back to 2013 with Michigan, it's the same thing. Like, so the teams by and large from the Big Ten that have made the championship game, that's the profile they've used. It hasn't been the Michigan State profile necessarily. It hasn't been the old, like the previous Wisconsin profile under Bo Ryan before he was like, hey, we can actually get talented players to come to Madison. So I do think there's a lot to be said for the way that you approach the game. I'll even go all the way back to Illinois, that Illinois team that made the 05 tournament. If you go back and look at their advanced stats, one of the best shooting teams in the country, didn't turn the ball over, really didn't care about getting to the free throw line, and was okay, but really not that great at offensive rebounding. So, yeah, I mean, to me, it's like, the one thing that all of those teams did end up doing well was they played really good defense. And that feels like, that Michigan team in 13 that Indiana beat for the Big Ten title, that was a little bit of their Achilles heel, but they overcame it with a hyper-efficient offense. And so there's a lot of things in this mix that are positive and, as you said, have been proven to win at the national level. And ultimately, it's going to come down to, how attractive is this package to get out to recruits, and, what is it that you can do early? Because if you can get the ball rolling properly right off the bat, and you look at the recruiting pedigree that he already established in year one, where you're able to pull 3 4-stars into West Virginia, which is more 4-stars than IU's been able to pull in a single class in how many years now?
Too long. We'll ask Scott. Scott will know.
Scott. But that's to me what's exciting about this from an X's and O's perspective, because there's just a lot of potential. Obviously, it's got to get done. And I guess this goes to the next set of questions, which is, I've heard this, you mentioned it, a lot of others have mentioned it, this guy's just a ball coach. He wants to just go out and play ball. That's what we heard about Archie Miller too, but it didn't translate onto the recruiting trail. What is it about Darian DeVries that you think will translate in a way that Archie Miller did not from that perspective?
All indications are that his like public persona and then how he is when he's between those lines are a lot different. And Doug McDermott was on the field of 68 with Goodman and those guys as soon as DeVries was hired, and he talked about like he's like, don't tell my dad, but I came to Creighton because of DeVries. Obviously a little tongue in cheek, but
Yep.
just talked about how great he was. And so I do think the difference here is that Archie Miller took the Indiana job because his brother told him, you don't pass on the Indiana job. He didn't really want it. Darren DeVries had a great job at West Virginia. That's a great job. It really is. They've got decent NIL. decent recruiting ground. They're supported by the state, and so he had a great job, and he left that because he wants the Indiana job. Like he doesn't care about the spotlight. He talked about a passionate fan base is a positive, not a negative. Play into that. So I think one of the biggest differences is certainly just the want to of the position and understanding what it all entails and owning that. The second part, Indiana has money to play with, and that doesn't hurt. That is a nice positive to have when you're out on the recruiting trail. Say you're not, a great salesman, but you can throw, hey, we're going to give you more money than anybody else. That certainly doesn't hurt the
Right.
matter.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be interesting because you were right on the nose when you said he felt uncomfortable with his prepared remarks. And then when he just started answering questions about how he approaches the game and what he thinks, there was a lot to like there. And look, I don't necessarily care how eloquent somebody sounds in a press conference. I mean, John Calipari is incredibly eloquent in a press conference, and most IU fans can't stand John Calipari. So there's a lot of, I don't know what you expect. I think it feels like he speaks a language that basketball players react well to. And I saw that Doug McDermott interview on Field of 68. It stuck out in a pretty interesting way. And look, I mean, ultimately, the sales pitch for Indiana should be an easier one than it appears to have been over the course of the last 8 years. All these guys, they're all competitive. The coaches I'm talking about, like they're all competitive. They all know basketball. Like it's not. I laugh when people say, "Well, this guy can't coach," or it's like you don't become a Division I coach not being able to coach unless you can recruit at an insane level, and even then you're doing something right with the job. I always get a kick out of that. But with DeVries, it does feel like there's a bit of a sweet spot there in that it's not just the way he communicates or his wanting to just go be a ball coach, but he clearly is able to get his level of competitiveness across to the people that he wants to come play for him. And that does, I think, vibe very well with the type of players that Indiana fans have been wanting to have in the program for a long time. And again, this is not just a Mike Woodson thing. It's also an Archie Miller thing. To some degree, it was a Tom Crean thing at the tail end. That 2016 team accepted. There were a lot of guys brought into the program where you were like, I'm not totally sure about this person's motivation structure. They're talented, but it doesn't seem like they're actually clicking with the system that's trying to be run. So, going off of what Zach Osterman said yesterday, which was accurate, which is Indiana's likely going to have to close this roster up pretty quickly because of the settlement date and because of the fact that there's a bunch of players that are about to hop into the portal. You've got some great players that are now eligible to go into the portal that lost in the tournament yesterday. You'll have more today. It's going to be an interesting thing watching DeVries try to piece all of that together on the fly while also putting his staff together and trying to get this message across saying, to some degree, like we're going to play a lot better offensively than we were at West Virginia, but we're going to play a lot better defensively than we were playing at Drake. That's an interesting message to be getting across to people, but the money should certainly help some.
Yeah, and you nailed it too. Like staff is important. You need guys that can do both recruit and coach. Like I think that's where Tom Crean talked about it the other day. He was like, "Gone are the days of just having a dude that's a good recruiter. Like that doesn't move the needle anymore for head coaches. Like you need to be able to recruit, but you also need to be able to understand the game, buy into the system, sell the system, things like that to get your foot in the door. Now, it's hard to say what Indiana's staff was under Mike Woodson. It seemed like they got the foot in the door to a lot of guys, and then they weren't able to seal the deal with a lot of, especially the high school recruits they went after. So that'll be very interesting to me how the staff shakes out. Seems like Ostrom is probably coming with DeVries. From all indications are that he'll be back at Indiana on the sidelines. I don't know that to be fact, so don't take that as gospel. And then Corey Barnett, I know is eligible for or eligible. He's been talked about for the Oral Roberts job, but he may also be coming with DeVries. Obviously, an alum of the program. Is his dad very high up with Adidas, and so that can't hurt. Um, And then there's the Chester Frazier piece where he was on his staff, and that's an interesting one. Because obviously there's the drama with Eric Gordon when they played 2 decades ago.
Almost
He
17 years. Yeah.
he did feed back into it when he was on the bench at Illinois a couple years ago on social media. But if DeVries wants to bring him aboard, I'm good with like whatever he wants to do, and however he thinks he should shape his staff. I'm good with it. I'd be surprised if too many guys from the previous regime are coming over or staying. I think Holes will probably stay around. That may be it. I'm not sure, but staff is going to be important. It really is. And the guys you surround yourself with are your culture builders. And CEO, they're your managers, trickles down to your players. You got to have a good staff in place to build your culture that you want.
Let me ask you this from a recruiting perspective. You're obviously pretty plugged into the Indiana high school scene and AAU and whatnot. How much repair work needs to be done by the men's basketball program in its relationship with the state? It's not like Indiana hasn't recruited the state, but there were a ton of really talented players that didn't come to Indiana over the last 8 years. There were a ton of players that I think Indiana wanted that they didn't get. So how much of that and what is the process of that? If you're a new coaching staff coming in, like how do you mend those fences? How do you get yourself into a position where you can be competitive for some of the recruits that you just haven't seen the program pull in?
I think the majority of the repair was done with Mike Woodson was let go. And I don't say that to be funny, but it's just it wasn't even a bad relationship. There just wasn't a relationship. Therefore, it soured a lot of people. Top recruits coming in, doesn't know their names, stuff like that. That just you can't have as the head coach of Indiana. If I'm DeVries, I'm making sure my butt's at the Indiana State Championship here next weekend. Just I'm sure things that Scott Dolson has already communicated before he even took the job of, look, here's the grassroots programs that you need to be involved with immediately. Here's the high school programs. Here's the coaches. Here's how to get in contact with them. And I have no doubts that Darian DeVries is going to do that. I have no doubts that Indiana will very quickly mend their relationships with the key players in the state. And some of that was already happening even with Scott Dolson, just trying to put some feelers out, make sure Indiana and the top programs are good. Because I think there is a misnomer like top AAU programs, you're not really going to like steer a kid one direction. You want what's best for the kid, but if it's neck and neck and he asks for your advice, hey, this guy's had a great relationship. Like those types of things matter. Like it's not like feeding a guy because you have a good relationship. But when a player asks for your advice, if you don't have a great relationship with that person, it's hard to give, good advice on that school. And so I think, like I said, I think it'll be repaired in short order. I have no doubts about that. If it is Ostrom coming aboard, he might have to put some feelers out there and maybe do some repair or whatnot. I don't really know. I wasn't around as much in the scene when he was there. So I don't know what those relationships were like with him, but you would think it would be a little bit easier as a plug and play here. He's coached for 4 or 5 years since, could perhaps, hopefully has learned from some shortcomings under the Archie Miller era. And as he moves forward, if he is indeed on the Indiana staff, we'll be better for it.
It's interesting looking at the last team that DeVries had at Drake and looking at where those players came from. And outside of Tucker DeVries, who obviously was from Waukee, Iowa, where they lived, there were not a ton of in-state players, and there were several transfers. So this is a coach that's had to deal with the transfer portal even a lower level. And I find two things fascinating about that Drake roster that year. That was cobbled together from all over the place. It's even their top contributors, like a Teen Wright, who's at North Texas this year, had come to them from Cal State Northridge. Darnell Brody had started at Seton Hall and had transferred in, and he was a player that played like 61% of minutes. Kevin Overton was from Oklahoma City. Like he was a freshman at Drake that year, but he came from Oklahoma City, so that was not a local recruit. Colby Garland was from Arkansas. he ended up transferring. He's on that Longwood team that was playing this year. And then Connor Enright, who may be joining him at Indiana. We'll see. He was at DePaul this last year, but he's from Mundelein, Illinois. He was not a guy that was from Iowa. So it is going to be interesting. Like, he doesn't need to necessarily recruit the state of Indiana like straight away, but it would be nice to get that started because there's clearly just a much greater depth of basketball talent available in the state of Indiana than he would have had access to at Drake. We didn't really get a chance to see what he would do at West Virginia, but he did pull in one local 4-star recruit. I'm assuming that guy's going to stay at West Virginia, but the other 2 guys he pulled in were from California. So it is interesting. Like, this is a guy who doesn't seem geographically constricted, but it'll be interesting to see how he handles having such a fertile recruiting ground in his backyard.
Yeah, like you mentioned, it's just having those relationships helps you. Like, say you go have that relationship now. In 4 years, when you have class like Braylon Mullins, Trent Sicily, and Jalen Harrelson, you've already got those relationships in place where you can. It's easy to go recruit them, understand who their high school coach is. All those things that seem, like they're kind of no-brainers, but Indiana just didn't really have under Mike Woodson. And I'm saying from the head coach level, like Indiana had good assistant coaching relationships with a lot of good people, but the head coach has to be involved. And it's just a lot of kids in Indiana grow up Indiana fans and they want to go there. Like, I know for a fact Braylon Mullins wanted to go to Indiana, but they couldn't do it. Like,
Yeah.
it's hard. And so you just can't lose those recruiting battles over and over, and let them get outside the state over and over. Like, you're going to lose some, like a Gary Harris and things like that under Tom Crean. But, at the end of the day, having those relationships in place early helps you down the line when you have a really, really good class like Indiana had this year.
Well, and the other thing, and you mentioned it earlier, is recruiting to the team that you're trying to put together and recruiting to the system that you're trying to run. It's that was one of the things with Archie Miller that Tony, are you still with me? You froze there.
I am. I'm frozen with my arms crossed, but I'm here.
It's a great look for you. Let's be clear about that. But one of the issues that now we're getting the back of Tony's computer. There, he's back. All right.
I'm back.
We know what monitor you have now. One of the issues that felt like Archie had that almost doomed his tenure from the start was he went out and signed that initial recruiting class. And, there were some decently heralded guys there in terms of, what the projections were, but a couple of them just never fit effectively. And a couple of them, it's almost like they hadn't been scouted hard enough because they just never took at this level. I mean, Jake Forrester, as an early recruit, was a good example of that. Demezi Anderson was a great example of that. And it almost felt like in the rush to try to recruit the state, the fit and how it was going to work within whatever system was going to operate, just that was not as much a part of the equation as it should have been. So that's clearly got to be something that DeVries and his staff focus on immediately. And they've got a track record of having done that.
Exactly. And that's what it's all about is fitting the roster how you want it to play. Demezi Anderson was like a stretch 4, and just that wasn't the style that Archie played. Like you said, just didn't make a lot of sense. And then he just never really fit in college basketball, to be honest. Like, he just wasn't. He needed to play in a free and open style, and that just that wasn't the Indiana program that Archie was running. He was playing Trace Jackson Davis and Joey Brunk together. Where does Demezi Anderson fit in that equation? So it's all about those things, and that's ultimately, like, Archie came in, like you said, with that I'm going to recruit inside out recruiting approach. Like, it doesn't have to be that. You don't have to get every single Indiana kid, but it's a lot easier when you have a 5-star in Braylon Mullins or a 4 fringe 5-star in Trent Sicily and Jalen Harrelson. It's easier to go up and watch them and recruit them when they're in your state, but you don't have to just build a team that's all Indiana kids. Like, I think that's also the misnomer with, like, Bob Knight's teams is like, you only got Indiana kids, and it's like, well, no.
Ton of kids from Ohio, ton of kids from Illinois. I mean, he recruited a lot more broadly than people thought. And also, obviously, you've got the transfer portal. We're not discounting that, but I always think in this era, you've got your can't miss pro prospects who are going to be gone pretty quickly. You want to pull those guys in even for a year because that's a talent you don't want to miss out on. But even if you don't get a recruit early, those recruits, they will filter through the game of college basketball. And you think about some of the teams that are out there right now that are having success in March Madness, and they've got players that started at lower levels who were able to matriculate up. It's like a farm system now to some degree, where you can get a guy who comes in as a 3-star. Maybe he was under scouted. Maybe he increased his work ethic, or maybe he had a growth spurt or really worked on his game. Now you've got players that are really at a competitive level far beyond where you started. If you've already built a relationship with them and they know who you are, when they're back in the portal and looking for a place to go, well, now you've got them in the mix. It's kind of what happened with Luke Goody. Now, Luke Goody probably should have been recruited by Indiana to begin with, but that's the type of player where it's like, if you're a safe harbor and it's a place that you have a positive perspective on, and you can look at the numbers, and it's like, go back to that Drake team I just mentioned, his last Drake team, where everybody had an offensive rating above 100 and almost everybody had an offensive rating above 110. That's going to appeal to a lot of players who want to showcase their skills.
Absolutely. Here's a question I have for you, because you're very much better versed in like the NCAA stuff. Where does Luke Goody's confidence come from in terms of his waiver? Because to me, it's pretty cut and dry on how the NCAA has applied that rule previously.
Right.
But he's obviously exuding a lot of confidence that he's getting this waiver. So I'm just curious, like, have things changed, or just because the NCAA has no leg to stand on anymore? I'm just curious how that all shaken out.
I mean, here's how I would look at it. You're right. And I think Jay Horry has mentioned this as well on the Back Home Network Discord. Like, the rule does not really provide Luke Goody with a direct pathway to an extra year of eligibility. However, the entire concept of NCAA eligibility is under attack in the courts. And they're having an increasingly hard time defending their rules in court, because ultimately they all seem kind of arbitrary. And the NCAA's made mistakes where they have given waivers on certain types of things, and then they denied the same types of waivers to other players, and they have a very opaque process. And so, there's currently, it's like the Diego Pavia thing last year, where, Diego Pavia ends up getting an extra year of eligibility. Now you've got players suing to get an extra year of eligibility, pointing to that situation and saying, well, why aren't we able to take advantage of this? And that whole suit was a suit filed November 24. He filed a lawsuit alleging that NIL policies for red shirts and JUCOs violated the Antitrust Act. These are the kinds of things that the NCAA is increasingly having trouble defending in court, because they are arbitrary and now there's money involved. And so I think Goody can sue not off of the straight up eligibility, but off the idea that he is being deprived of financial rights that he should be able to take advantage of. And what's the difference between missing 20 or 70% of the games at the end of the season versus missing 70% of the games at the beginning of the season? Like, what is the actual difference there? And you try to, what's the defense? What it's like, if you miss the same number of games, but they're at the start of the year as opposed to the end of the year, how do you, as the NCAA, justify that one of them gets an extra year of eligibility, but the other one does not? I don't know that you necessarily can. I think that's where the confidence comes from. And I think the NCAA, rather than getting a case that could go up the ladder to the Supreme Court and get the entirety of the eligibility rules thrown out, they'd rather fold on things that are close enough to whatever the other examples are that we can point to.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And having him at a 4 or on the wing, you're just, if he does indeed get that waiver, you look, and then you have a Trent Sisley who would be in the rotation. You're looking at a level of shooting that Indiana just has not had on the roster in a long, long time.
Mm-hmm. And just to clarify, the Pavia, I didn't do a great job of explaining the Pavia lawsuit. Basically, he won this lawsuit arguing that there was a violation of antitrust law because they didn't count as junior college, or they counted as junior college seasons against him, even though junior college is not part of the NCAA. Now, that might not seem like it's connected to the idea that, well, this guy was injured for a certain amount of time. But again, it's the whole idea of what is eligibility and why is it so arbitrarily applied based upon X, Y, or Z. And yeah, the NCAA has been able to say forever, hey, this is just how we do things. But now they're having to actually explain themselves in court, which they'd never had to do before. So that's it. But man, if he could get that extra season, it adds just a whole nother dimension to what this Indiana roster could be, because that's a proven Big Ten three-point shooter that you don't have to go out and try to recruit, and a guy who would be, in his sixth year of college basketball, which is we're seeing at places, especially like Auburn, that is, and I think X's and Joe's has mentioned this on the show a couple of times, having that level of experience is such a huge advantage, because obviously a 23-year-old or a 24-year-old is just going to be fundamentally like better at basketball in most cases than an 18 or 19-year-old in the same spot.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And like you said, it would add a dynamic to Indiana's team. And like you said, it's just one less guy that DeVries has to go out into the portal and try and find to plug a hole, because he fit of what he wants, right? And so it's just
If you're
one less guy
drawing,
you got to.
if you're drawing up like the pool of wings, and trying to figure out who to slot in there, yeah, Luke Goody would be like one of the first guys you'd identify, like high level shooter, and a guy who can play good enough defense within the system to make it worth his while, and a guy that his offensive rating this year, I actually think people underrated how good he was. He was in the top 100 in terms of offensive rating, and he was first in the conference. If you took conference only games, Luke Goody was first in the conference in offensive rating. He had an offensive rating of 133.5. He was sixth in the conference in effective field goal percentage, and he was first in the conference in turnover rate. Like, that's how low his turnovers were. So that is exactly the type of player you'd be looking for in this type of a system.
Yeah, and he really didn't get it going until what, January-ish. So it makes sense that, his overall numbers were a little down, but then in conference play he just blossomed, and that's when he got more playing time and things like that. So yeah, definitely a dude that would help Indiana win a lot of games next year.
Yeah, between the Penn State game in the Palestra and the end of the regular season in the Big Ten, I think he only had 3 games where he didn't score in double figures. Actually 4, sorry. But still, I mean, that's a huge bulk of games where he was in double figures every single time. So, yeah, that would be nice to have. Anything else you can think of that's worth mentioning with Darian DeVries coming in, and just your overall kind of sentiment as we head into this offseason and think about 25-26 with the Hoosiers?
Yeah, I don't want to like promote myself, but I would encourage everybody to go watch.
Please
that.
Promote yourself, Tony. We're going to put a link to the video in the Substack for those of you who are subscribing.
Well, my point is that it's really easy to get hyper focused on Ken Pom and Bart Torvik and be like, man, their offensive rating was lower than any of Mike Woodson's offensive ratings last year. Like, what are we doing here? Why would we hire this guy? But then when you look at how he created space for his players, what he accentuated in his offenses, how his defenses played, like, to me, that's a very important part of evaluating a coach, is actually looking at what they do and what they're trying to accomplish. And then he had to, like you mentioned, he had to change his style. He lost 2 of his top scorers within 10 games of the season starting. So then he had to change a lot, and really kind of went from an offensive-minded coach to a defensive-minded coach. Like, look, we're going to have to hunker down here because we're not as talented as most of the teams that we're playing. Made it more of a possessions game, hunkered down the defensive end, and ran good actions offensively. Sometimes, obviously, not super efficient. They didn't shoot the ball very well last year. He mentioned that in his press conference. Lost their best shooter. That obviously that hurts. But I would just encourage, because I know there was hesitations by everybody when they saw the hire, because the first thing you go do is go look at, all right, well, what do you do on Ken Pom? What do you do on Bart Torvik?
Yep.
And you start getting real nervous. It's like 131 in adjusted offensive efficiency. That's horrible, or whatever. But then when you go look at what they were doing, how they're running actions, the space he's creating, guys he's getting open, how he's getting them open, I think it would ease a lot of anxieties when you go watch that, because it's a modern style of play on both ends of the floor. And ultimately, that's what you want. And then when you plug more talented people into that modern style of play, obviously you get better. And then, the things that Scott Dolson mentioned, very good in one possession games, very good in games decided by 5 points or less. Those little intangible things matter a whole lot. And Indiana's kind of getting him in his sweet spot, at 49 years old. If he's successful, you could have him 15, 20 years. And but he's old enough to have had some coaching experience, some D1 head coaching experience, Power 5 experience, even if it was only a year, or Power 4 or Power 2 or whatever you want to call it these days. But yeah, so I think that Indiana got him in a really good sweet spot, and I think it's why they probably ultimately chose kind of the Greg McDermott protege rather than Greg McDermott, because if you go hire Dick McDermott, 6, 7, 8 years tops. Whereas this guy, this is somebody that you can have there for the long term.
And I think most importantly, it's a fundamental shift in style of play and approach to coaching the game, which, as we've heard with Mike Weemuth and his theory of opposites on X's and Joe's, is generally how these things go. And I think it's something that IU fans are certainly going to warm up to. It's one of those things where it's such an offensively driven game now, and it requires modern offensive principles. It requires spacing. It requires getting shooters. It requires, doing things with, plugging different types of players into that system, but being consistent in what you're trying to hunt on a daily basis. And it does feel like you get a guy who is on the upswing, like entering that prime period of their career. You've got a better shot. It's a dice roll, but all coaching hires to some degree are dice rolls. But the profile matches where I think Indiana wants to be and where I think fans will enjoy being in terms of style of play over the course of the next several years. And we'll just keep our fingers crossed that that's how it works out. So,
Absolutely.
All right. Well, Tony Adragna, you can check out his work, IU Film Room. You can search Tony Adragna, Adragna, on YouTube. He's on Back Home Network podcasts on a regular basis. We're fortunate to have him around. Tony, thank you for joining me, and we'll look forward to seeing what roster this IU team ends up with here after the next few weeks.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Galen. And I do want to just plug the Back Home Network and how awesome the content has been throughout this coaching search. Galen has been burning the midnight oil. It's like every day I got a new podcast in my feed. Like I told him yesterday on the phone, like I can't keep up.
Hey.
I'm a couple behind. I'm still listening to podcasts about coaching candidates on CrimsonCast. But been fantastic work. Then you've got the X's and Joe's stuff that's been awesome. The Assembly Call guys are doing emergency podcasts. As soon as the hire's made, like it's just been really cool to see all the content churning out of the Back Home Network. So just want to give kudos there because it's been fantastic stuff. And I don't follow a lot of other networks or programs, outside of Indiana, but I'd be surprised if there's other teams that have the amount of content from just a bunch of guys that are just fans, at the end of the day, that are producing such quality work. So just want to plug that and say thanks to everybody at the Back Home Network.
Well, thank you, Tony. We really appreciate it. And hey, you got to give the people what they want, right? That's the first rule of media. So it's been a lot of fun. I'm glad we're at the end of the coaching search, and it's great to just kind of talk about what to expect next. I was certainly done. And of course, all those coaching profiles we didn't do the one guy that Indiana ended up hiring, which I'll remember that for next time. So anyway, Tony Adragna joining us here. Thank you, Tony. And thanks to all you folks for listening in. Thanks to our title sponsor from Home Field Apparel. We will be back with more podcasting soon. We'll talk about what's going on in the NCAA tournament. We'll talk about roster changes, coaching staff. So much to talk about moving forward. Looking forward to it, folks. For the Back Home Network, I'm Galen Clavio. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. Bring back the Bison. Stay never daunted. So long, everybody.